So Amy Wrobleski is going to give a talk titled Mushroom Hunting and Mycology in the Mid-Atlantic. Amy's a PhD candidate at the ecology program at Penn State, and she's working on a number of projects, but overall, her interests are to the relationship between people and their environment. And her goal is to combine ecological and social science methods to better understand the world around us. And I think this is an extremely noble and exciting goal, and really cool to think about the relationship between people and the natural world. So welcome, Amy. Thank you so much. Very excited. And you guys probably recognize Amy because she did a survey that we tried to get you all to fill out. So
that's what I'm going to talk about today. So let me share my screen. Yeah, can everyone see the slides? Are we good?
Yeah, great.
Awesome. Yeah, so my name's Amy Wrobleski. I'm grad student at Penn State, like you just heard. I'm working with Dr. Eric Burkhart on this project looking at mushroom hunting and mycology in the Mid-Atlantic. So this was just a quick intro slide. You pretty much just got the information on it. But yeah, overall, I'm interested in foraged plants and mushrooms, and overall just like positive experiences that people have with the environment, because in particular, ecology tends to focus a lot on those more negative interactions. A little bit about my background though. Before graduate school, I was at University of Texas. I mostly grew up in Texas. I got a degree in history and ecology, and then I went on to be a field technician, herbarium technician, lab technician, all sorts of technicians at Michigan State University and University of Michigan for a few years. And the picture on the right is a project I worked on the impacts of climate change on prairie communities in Michigan. And it was a lot of fun. And that's actually where I first got interested in foraging broadly. I got interested in plants before I got interested in mushrooms. But one of the stations I was working at had an ethnobotany class, which is basically researching people and plants. And that really, I didn't even realize that people still foraged, to be honest, before that job. And it really opened my eyes to a whole new world. And now I'm in grad school. So during grad school, I worked as a mentor with the College of Menominee Nation on a project involving ethnobotany. I've worked in the greenhouse. I've worked in the herbarium, which is basically a museum for plants, doing a whole plant study that I'm not going to talk about today. And I've also done some outreach with the Arboretum here at Penn State. So, yeah, you've probably already heard about this survey that I've been doing. Basically, I've been doing for the past 2 years a survey of mushroom hunters in the Mid-Atlantic, and that's what I'm going to be sharing the results from for you all today. So the project so far, it began in spring 2020 during lockdown. That was really early stages. This was originally just going to be a project on COVID-19. And as I started talking to people, it became really obvious there was a lot more to this community than people getting excited about mushrooms during the pandemic. So that made survey development take a little longer, but it launched in March 2020. And you all actually helped support that launch and the survey continuing to be open through a few weeks ago. It closed in September 2023. A lot of what that support went towards was actually sending out these art prints, or in some cases stickers. Everyone who filled out a survey got an art print or a sticker. And that was a hugely amazing resource. Also, the art prints are by Kat Pugh, and she's amazing. So I'm hoping to finish analyzing all the data by the end of 2023. What you're going to see today is not all, if you've taken the survey, there were a lot of questions. This isn't the answers to all the questions, and a lot of the figures are not in their final form. So there's still some analysis that has to be done, but I just wanted to thank everyone who did fill it out, or everyone that supported the survey in various ways, sharing it with your friends and family and coworkers. You all are amazing, and this project literally would not exist without the support of this club and other clubs and communities like it. So hold on, my cat's destroying a piece of paper. Buddy, no. Okay. So how has this really not been done already? This seems like a really basic question, but in reality, these sort of studies have mostly been confined to the Pacific Northwest in the United States. There's also a ton of studies that have been done in Europe, but even in the Pacific Northwest, they've pretty much been focused on Matsutake. There's also a really good paper about the increase in regulation in California by David Aurora. The title is really misleading. It's a paper that says it's about porcini, but the second half gets into California foraging politics, and it's very dramatic. The East Coast does have some research on mushroom hunting, but it's pretty much exclusively focused on morel mushrooms. And there's not really any studies of mushroom hunting and mycology in the region broadly. There's also no review on what the rules and regulations are like here, so nothing like that David Aurora paper that I just mentioned. So a really big hole in terms of who's doing what and what's going on. So that led to some guiding questions, and there's some additional things that I'm doing in my dissertation, but these are going to be the questions I'm going to address in this talk tonight. So first off, just who is mushroom hunting in the Mid-Atlantic region? And then what species are people harvesting and what methods are they using and what are their interests? And then finally, what concerns do mushroom hunters and mycologists have for the future and how can they be addressed? So this gets into the nitty-gritty methods of the survey. I used what's called a convenience and snowball sample. So there is no list of mushroom hunters. In an ideal world, you would have a list of people who are part of the mushroom hunting community and you would send them the survey randomly. That does not exist. So I went to clubs, I went to events, I sent out little blurbs and newsletters and just talking to people one-on-one to ask them to take the survey. That's the convenience sampling part. The snowball sampling is then if those people were like, hey, I don't really do mushrooms, but my cousin does, my friend does, and they send it along to another person. So it's a little bit of both, but it's mostly a convenience sample. Oh, there was also posts that were done on social media, so mushroom hunting Facebook groups, shared on some Instagram accounts, and there was also some flyering that took place. So all pretty boots on the ground trying to get the word out about this survey. So this is just a brief rundown on the questions that were asked. It's basically demographic information, how people are using mushrooms, what activities they might be doing, things like sustainability practices. It's a whole list. And when people completed the survey, this is a picture of the sticker form of the art print, but they got mailed that sticker. So I'm just going to jump right into who is mushroom hunting in the Mid-Atlantic, or the demographics of this survey. So the first thing I wanted to look at is how did people even find out about this survey? Like I was saying, there's a lot of different ways that people could have potentially found out about this survey. We did a lot of different methods for recruitment, but the number one way is through a mushroom club. 205 people found out through a mushroom club. The next biggest way is through a Facebook group. And then from there, it kind of becomes lots of different categories. Things like classes and workshops, a friend, a few people found out through Twitter of all places. So a pretty good diversity, but mushroom clubs are a huge amount of survey respondents. Okay. And then the next question was, are you from the Mid-Atlantic? There were people who filled out the survey who weren't from the Mid-Atlantic. And I also want to note, these are people who completed the survey. The total number of survey responses was about 1,200, but I only analyzed the data if people completed at least half of the survey. That way their results are a little more comparable to each other. So about 900 people completed the survey, and of those 900 people, 826 were from the Mid-Atlantic region. So those are the results that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So how old is the mushroom hunting and mycological community? The mean age is about 43, with a pretty strong skew towards younger ages. And also keep it, the min is 18 because I didn't have approval to give this survey to kids. In reality, there are definitely kids who are going out mushroom hunting with their families. So this is just a survey of adults. But overall, the number of people mushroom hunting seems to decline as people get older. The next thing I asked about was the gender of survey respondents. A majority of respondents were women, but obviously there were also a lot of men who filled out the survey, and also quite a few agender and non-binary folks. In terms of race, the mushroom hunting community is mostly white, but there's still a lot of diversity here. So that is going on. And then also in terms of education, most people have at least a high school degree, but a lot of people have vocational school or other types of higher education. Income also is a pretty widely distributed. Not a lot of people in the lowest income, not a lot of people in the highest income, but a lot of people pretty firmly in the middle. And then I just asked the question, how often do you go out hunting for mushrooms? Like, if you're going to go outside, are you mushroom hunting? And most people said always. And a few people actually did say never, which I was kind of surprised by, but they might be growing mushrooms. There's other ways they could be participating in the community that would cause them to fill out this survey. And then I asked, how often do you teach other people? And this is where there's kind of a discrepancy. People are always going, when they're going outside, looking for mushrooms, but a lot fewer people are teaching others about hunting for mushrooms. There's some people who sometimes are teaching others, but there's a pretty good number of people, 248, who never teach other people about mushrooms. And unfortunately, I did find that this finding does significantly break down along gender, where men are a lot more likely to teach people about mushroom hunting than women are. I'm still digging into those results, but that made me a little bit sad. But I also asked, do you sell wild mushrooms? And overwhelmingly, the answer was no among survey respondents. So it wasn't just a yes or no question, though. There was yes, and they sell in Pennsylvania, because the survey was originally only in Pennsylvania. Yes, but they live in a different state. No, and they're not interested in getting more information or selling in the future. And no, they don't sell right now, but they are interested in getting more information in the future. So not only are most mushroom hunters and mycologists not currently selling mushrooms, a majority are not interested in selling mushrooms in the future. So most people who filled out the survey, at least, are very interested in mushrooms and mycology as a hobby, as a fun thing to do, not as a way to make money. So brief overview, who's mushroom hunting? People tend to be younger who mushroom hunt, with an average age of about 43. Women make up a majority of the survey respondents, but there is a slight bias because women tend to fill out surveys more than men, but it's at least 50-50. A majority of respondents are white, and a majority of respondents have some level of higher education and are also middle income. So that gets into the more interesting questions, because I know that's pretty dry. So what are people harvesting when they're going out? So I wanted to get through all 900 survey responses before this talk. And I got through about 250 in about 6 hours, because I asked people, what's your favorite mushroom, to get at this question, and why. And people have a lot of opinions on their favorite mushrooms. So of the 250 I had gotten through before coming here tonight, I'd gotten about 73 species or broad species groups. You'll see there's a whole mix of common names, Latin names. There's probably things misspelled on here. The final list, I'm going to go through and find all of the things that might have overlapping names, get all the Latin names on here, but people are interested in a lot of different mushrooms in the Mid-Atlantic region. So just focusing on the top ones, because that was a very lengthy list, morel is the mushroom that has come up the most. I didn't find that surprising personally. And pretty much all of these top mushrooms are either edible or medicinal. So medicinal ones are things like reishi, turkey tail, chaga, and some of them are a little bit of both. I don't think it made the top list, but lion's mane is pretty high up there, and that people are usually listing that as both edible and medicinal. So it can be both. But then also I did analyze, like, why are people interested in each of these mushrooms? So there's a little bit of weird phrasing here. The way that I'm analyzing this data is the first time that topic comes up, I use the wording that the person who brought up the topic used. So best tasting is actually edibility. That'll be changed in the future. But again, because morels are the top one, it's not really surprising that edibility is the big thing that people are interested in, along with people being comfortable IDing something. So a lot of those top mushrooms have really distinctive identification. There's not a lot of lookalikes, or any of the lookalikes are really, really easy to figure out. The things I find interesting are a mushroom being difficult to find and a mushroom being easy to find are both really, really appealing for people on why it's their favorite mushroom. So you either love a challenge or you love just walking around and seeing mushrooms everywhere, and both extremes are brought up. Another one that's brought up pretty often, and I've just called beauty here, but is people who just love the aesthetics of a mushroom. So chicken of the woods gets mentioned a lot under this category, actually, where people just talk about how much they love a mushroom because of how it looks over everything else. So there's a lot of different reasons that people like mushrooms in addition to food. I also asked how many mushrooms people harvested at various times of year. Um, I mean, earlier people were talking about going outside and there being mushrooms everywhere right now. We're in fall, so you can see a lot of people are harvesting 1 to 5 species, is that bright blue color, and then followed by 6 to 10. Very few people aren't harvesting anything in the fall. You compare that to winter, and the number 0 is that dark color. So a lot of people are just not harvesting anything in the winter, or harvesting very, very few species. In the spring, you can see there's a lot of people, again, harvesting 1 to 5 species. Those are probably morels for the most part, to be honest. And summer is very similar to fall, where those summer and fall are just the 2 seasons where people are harvesting the most. Regardless, you always have a few people who are in the 21 plus category, and that's a very broad group of people. There were some results that listed literally hundreds, which I could believe in the summer. I believe a little less in the spring. I do know some of these respondents, because they said in their responses, are involved in DNA barcoding. So that does get complicated, where it's like, yeah, you probably are aware that you're recording hundreds of species because you are doing the genetics research behind it, versus the average everyday person doesn't have those resources. So that could also be what we're seeing. But people are harvesting in the summer and the fall, a little bit in the spring, and not a whole lot in the winter. I also asked what activities are people doing while they're mushroom hunting, or why. So these are different activities people could do, and you can always do it, often do it, sometimes do it, never do it, or rarely do it. So all the darker scores towards the right, if someone put that down, they're saying they always do a thing when they're mushroom hunting, versus the lighter scores, they're saying they rarely do a thing. So do you hunt mushrooms for medicinal purposes? A few people put always, a lot of people put rarely. The things that I found most interesting here were the fact that, backing up that data before, very, very few people are going out to sell mushrooms. So seeing that both places kind of confirms, like, yeah, this is a real data point. People, at least who respond to the survey, are not interested in selling mushrooms. A lot of people are harvesting for food, which makes sense. And then also, a vast majority of people are doing it to spend time in nature. That is just a really big reason on why people are mushroom hunting, but they're not necessarily doing it while hunting and fishing, and they're not necessarily doing it while doing other conservation related activities, which were other things that I thought people might want to be doing while they're outside hunting for mushrooms. So just recapping on what species people are interested in. They're overall interested in edible species with really few toxic lookalikes. People also enjoy mushrooms because they're seasonal, they're medicinal, they're pretty, they're both easy and hard to find, in addition to them being tasty. And people use mushroom hunting as a way to spend time in nature, and very, very few people are actually selling wild mushrooms. So that then gets into concerns for the future. So I just asked people as a free response question, what are your concerns for the future? And ended up sorting them into these main groups. So ticks is literally anything related to ticks and Lyme disease. Regulation involves government regulation of mushrooms or any sort of state or federal regulation that might impact outdoor activities. Poisoning is people getting sick or poisoning themselves from a mushroom. Over-harvesting and harvesting practices are any concerns having to do with people picking mushrooms and those mushrooms going into decline in some way. Invasive species is a pretty broad category. It's any invasives that might be impacting the ecosystem that mushrooms live in, or also impacting the mushrooms directly, or also potentially mushrooms being an invasive species. Habitat destruction is also pretty broad. This includes things like cutting down or destroying habitat, pollution, fracking, all of those things fell under habitat destruction. Economics and commercial mushroom hunting were concerns over people selling mushrooms. COVID-19 was concerns overly impacted COVID-19 to mushroom hunting and mycology and the community overall. Connection to nature was people talking about concerns over people not being connected to nature usually, or helping people forage that connection. Climate change is most of the time people just point blank mentioning climate change, but also any other mention of concerns about things like drought or changing weather. And then the last one is access to information, which is concerns or a call for like, hey, we need more information to actually safely mushroom hunt. So, as you can see, habitat destruction is the biggest concern amongst people. Very, very closely followed by overharvesting and climate change, and still pretty high up there is regulation. Some of these things tend to be very interrelated. Like regulation tends to be very interrelated with over-harvesting, for example, and I'm going to get into that in a moment, versus climate change is people usually bring up on its own. But a pretty wide array of issues and concerns. But I'm actually going to focus for the rest of this talk on the regulation and over-harvesting concern, because when I looked at this, I was immediately like, this might be something that I might be able to at least get more information on, versus climate change. I think there needs to be more research done on it, and I would like to do more research on that in the future, but I don't have the tools to do it right now. So I wanted to directly address concerns about overharvesting. And as I looked through the literature, it was pretty clear that when looking at overharvesting, you needed to sort mushrooms into their actual different growing habits rather than going species by species, because there are just too many species of mushroom, and we don't even know all the species of fungi that are out there. So I'm going to break this down into ectomycorrhizal and saprobic. So ectomycorrhizal mushrooms have a mycelia that interacts with a host species, usually in the soil, and sometimes to the benefit of that host species. A lot of edible mushrooms globally fall into this category. Morels are a really good example. Chanterelles, most things that grow out of the soil. there's been lots of studies on the long-term impacts of harvest on these species. Again, it's mostly in Europe and the Pacific Northwest because that's where a lot of these studies have been done. A lot on chanterelles, weirdly. But all of these studies kind of point to the overall idea that plucking or cutting ectomycorrhizal mushroom does not harm the overall fungi. It doesn't harm the mycelia underneath. What does actually, and these are long-term ecological studies, they take about 10 years to do. So you're able to see what you did in year 1 if the fungi is able to actually rebound by year 10. So what actually prevented fungi from recovering from harvest was not the harvesting itself, but things like habitat destruction, pollution, and big ecosystem changes. These sort of things were really, really big if the soil was changed. So soil pollution was a huge thing that harmed mycorrhizal mushrooms, but also the disappearance of host trees through invasive species or through really intensive logging where the landscape wasn't able to recover. So ectomycorrhizal mushrooms are not so much harmed by individual picking, they're harmed by overall environmental damage. Saprobic mushrooms have their mycelia growing into usually rotting wood and the fruiting body, which is the mushroom, growing out of that wood. So they're consuming the nutrients in that rotting wood, and once those nutrients are gone, there will no longer be mushrooms or fungi in and on that log. There have been considerably less studies on saprobic mushrooms, and some saprobic mushrooms are things like chicken of the woods, for example. They're potentially at a higher risk for harvesting because if you think about it, ectomycorrhizal mushrooms growing out of the soil, having a relationship with a living tree, they can just keep going. Like, as long as environmental conditions are okay, they'll just continue to persist in the soil. Versus the saprobic mushrooms will eventually run out of food, the rotting log that they're eating. So they have to successfully release their spores and reproduce and colonize a new rotting log. If someone were to go and remove every single chicken of the woods, for example, before it was able to release its spores, that might remove that species from that area. However, those long-term studies I was talking about for ectomycorrhizal mushrooms don't exist for saprobic species for the most part. We don't know if that's actually how it would play out in theory. The other thing is saprobic mushrooms tend to be the ones that if you buy a grow kit, they're saprobic. You're giving it medium to eat. That means that there's a lot more potential for conservation practices for saprobic mushrooms. So if a mushroom were to disappear from an area and we knew how to inoculate it, you could put an inoculated log or go out and inoculate areas to reintroduce that mushroom to an area. But that's super understudied, and there definitely needs to be more work on these mushrooms. So I then went and decided to look into the regulation of mushroom picking on public lands in the US because a lot of the regulation stuff was people saying, I'm concerned that I won't be able to pick mushrooms on public land anymore for my own personal use. So I went through and looked at the legality of picking mushrooms in every state in the US for both personal use and commercial use. I made a scoring system where type of land. So I looked at like state parks, national parks in each state. Each type of public land was given a score of 1 if mushroom hunting was allowed and 0 if it wasn't. I then added up all the scores. So the higher score that a state got, the less restrictive it was to mushroom hunting. So a state with a score of 5 would be really friendly to mushroom hunting. A state with a score of 0 would basically not allow mushroom hunting. And all these documents were reviewed in June and July of 2023, so things might have changed. So I found some overall themes in the regulation. I found that mushroom hunting for personal use usually doesn't need a permit. There's a big usually by all of this because there's an exception to every one of these. It can also be restricted to edible species only. This is really common in national parks. And it usually is allowed on most types of public land. Commercial use, on the other hand, so you're picking to sell, pretty much always needs a permit. And many states have a list of species that can be sold. And if your species isn't on that list, you can't legally sell it in that state. And it's usually not allowed on public land. There is some overlap a lot, like for both personal use and commercial use. There are often harvesting limits. This can be everything from a gallon bucket to, I saw one park that literally said a plastic Walmart bag, which was really specific. So they can also have harvesting guidelines, like distances you're allowed to harvest from the trail, pinching versus cutting for harvesting, and whether removal of species from dead wood is allowed. So there's a whole lot going into this. I wanted to keep it brief for tonight. So this is just an overview map of that scoring from 1 to 5 that I was talking about. So the more blue a state is, the more friendly it is to commercial harvesting. But if it's blue, that means it's not, backing up. The more blue it is, the more friendly it is to personal use harvesting. The more pink it is, the more friendly it is to commercial harvesting. And the more purple it is, the friendlier it is for both. So just to use Pennsylvania as an example, Pennsylvania is very, very blue. In Pennsylvania, you're pretty much allowed to mushroom hunt for personal use on most types of public land, but you're not really allowed to pick for commercial use on almost any types of public land. You compare that to just another state nearby is Michigan, which is purple. So you can mushroom hunt in Michigan on public land for both personal use and commercial use. You might have to go through a lot of permits and a lot of paperwork, but there's a legal path for you to do it. There are some states that are no color on this map. So like New Jersey is a nearby state. California is probably the biggest one, where the scores are on the low end for both personal use and commercial use, which means on most types of public land, you cannot mushroom hunt there, which is where a lot of the concerns about regulation are coming from. There are states that are already in our region, or in the case of California, very, very large, that do not allow mushroom hunting on public land, even for personal use. So the next steps, I'm going to finish up the data analysis for this survey, hoping to finish that up literally in the next 2 weeks. But I'm also doing something right now called key informant interviews, where I'm seeing some results in my data that actually really, really surprised me that I didn't show tonight because I'm still kind of trying to figure them out. But part of the way I'm trying to figure them out is interviewing people who are in the mushroom hunting community, in the mycology community, and might have some insights. So if you'd be interested in being interviewed, it's a 15 or 20-minute Zoom call, and feel free to email me or send me a message on here once I'm done, and I'd love to talk to you. I'm planning on defending my dissertation, which is just a tiny snippet of everything, in February 2023, and that's going to be open to the public, and there'll also be a Zoom link available because it's hard to get to central Pennsylvania. So more data and more results coming soon. So yeah, I just wanted to thank some people. I want to thank my lab. I didn't put it on here, but everyone in my lab has been super supportive and amazing. You all and your support, obviously. This project's also been funded by the Huck Institute at Penn State and the ecology program as well. And this is my contact info if anyone, wants to get in touch. So yeah, I'm good for
Thank you so
questions.
much, Amy. That was awesome. It's
Thanks.
so even the parts that you said were like more dry, like even just like the basic demographics and like seeing the age chart, so, like that stuff is so interesting to me too. Like,
yeah,
I don't know, it's really it's very cool. And I also love what you said about people are interested in things that are either very hard to find or very easy to find. Like, that's just so funny. And it's like, so it really is almost like one of these like Rorschach like ink blot tests for people, like,
oh yeah, and
why
a lot
why
of
they go to
people who
Little
were Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah.
A lot of the people who were liking the ones that were hard to find compared it to an Easter egg hunt a lot. Adult Easter egg hunt came up over and over again. Yeah, also, yeah, it should have been February 2024. If it was 2023, I messed up and time is a flat circle right now.
So, so I do
Yeah,
have a question. Instead of typing it, I just wanted to ask it out
yeah.
loud. So after collecting all this empirical data, perusing it,
Mhm.
interviewing people, myself included, I think I might have responded to your survey more than once. Sorry, I may have skewed the results. But what kind of predictions are you making? Can you come up with any predictions about what's going to happen to mushroom hunting in the mid-Atlantic Northeast in the years to come? Because mushrooms are really having a day. They're more in the news cycle every day.
Yeah.
It seems.
I so I don't this gets into somewhat my personal opinion. I personally don't think over harvesting from people is going to be a huge issue for most species. I didn't get into it here, but I think there's some standout ones like chaga that, because of their biology and how trendy they are right now, I think that species like that could potentially be at risk. And I'm hoping that the mushrooms, yeah, having a moment actually leads to more funding and more interest to do a lot of the research that needs to be done on things like, do mushrooms pick up toxins from the environment? Because that's something that people brought up as a concern in the habitat destruction section with pollutants a lot, because especially folks I've talked to in the Pittsburgh area will talk about how, like, hey, I find a bunch of stuff in my lawn, but I'm right across the street from like an old steel like processing area. My whole yard's probably contaminated with things I don't want to eat. Is this safe for me to eat? And I'm like, I don't know. And I don't think I don't know if it is safe for humans to eat this or not. So I think it might push more funding, because at least on the Penn State side of things, there's very little funding towards any sort of mushrooms that aren't button mushrooms. It's just, there's a disconnect there. So that is like the positive take on it. I think the bigger threats to mushrooms outside of overharvesting are things like climate change. Just with summers getting drier, there not really being a snowpack. I think those dynamics are really hard to understand. Yeah.
Amy, I had an interesting kind of thought. There's
Mhm.
I think a lot of people forget that there is such thing as invasive fungi too, and how that might even play into your list. I see golden oysters come up a lot,
Yeah.
and like they're not freaking from around here, and so they have escaped cultivation, and so I'm curious as to how how those results might play into your work. And also another point that I saw someone else bring up. I have a very Eastern European background. My family is
Mhm.
Ukrainian and Russian, and so aside from just race, like I think it's really interesting incorporating like perhaps an ethnicity component too, because that's just like a way of life out there. Whereas
Yeah.
in the States, that's like it's just the cool cats like us that come together and do stuff like this. So I don't know. It's just some things I was thinking about while you were presenting.
I mean, so something that did come up in the favorite mushroom section uh was, there's definitely some towns in central Pennsylvania, at least, they'll have different names for mushrooms that are very much like Polish, Eastern European, that sort of thing. And that does show up. And I was actually thinking about that earlier today on, ooh, I might want to go back and like make note of all of those. Because I'm my family's Polish also. And but went to Detroit, like downtown Detroit instead. So that tradition got lost, but there's still like family lore about it, basically. But yeah, the invasive mushrooms, I am really interested to see how much of a, like, I don't want it to become a problem in the future, but I mean, golden oysters, like you said, have spread everywhere. There's a lot of people who are growing mushrooms that might not be native to this area. At NEMF, there was actually a talk about golden oyster, and they mentioned a lab. I forget where it is. I know it's somewhere in the Midwest. It might be Ohio State. But they're doing research on golden oyster to see, I guess there's 6 cultivated strains of golden oyster, and so far it's only been confirmed that 2 of them have escaped, but they're doing experiments to see, like, is it actually only 2? And then also, do the mycelia of golden oyster actually push out all the other mushrooms in a log? So are they, it's like the difference between a noxious weed and a new neighbor. So yeah.
Sometimes your new neighbor is
I'll
a
just say
noxious
I'm
weed.
personally
Exactly.
I just say I'm personally in favor of one of those famous Italian truffles becoming an invasive species here.
Yeah, well, like Areobolides projectilis, which is a wonderful bolete, has invaded from us to Eastern Europe, and people really complain about it. But I'm like, if you're gonna get an invader, I'd rather get a delicious and stunningly beautiful bolete than the death cap. Thanks, guys. Like,
yeah.
yeah. That's super cool. I also like so I have a real interest in kind of like the like maybe kind of neuroscience or like also like psychology behind foraging, and like it's always interesting to me to think about, like, the major dopamine surge that we all get when we find things, and how that kind of helps us to learn. And what you were saying, what Dan was saying too, it made me wonder, like, even for those of us who have like my family many generations ago was in Eastern Europe, I have no idea if they had anything to do with mushrooms, but like I'm really good at finding mushrooms. And like I think of all the things that I like try to do, like I'm way better at finding mushrooms than at identifying them, or anything else. Like, and so it makes me think, like, is there some, like, I mean, obviously not a single gene, but is there like some like genetic gestalt, like where, you're 23andMe could tell you, like, your family probably foraged in Eastern Europe or something. I don't know.
So first I will say the like dopamine rush from foraging, when I was saying like, yeah, there's some data I'm still trying to understand, that is very much what I'm trying to figure out. The really short version of it is basically people seem to be mushroom hunting or picking up, being interested in mushrooms during really, really uncertain times. So times like COVID. And I'm trying to kind of suss out what are the different reasons that people might be attracted to mushrooms and mycology versus, you can always just go on a walk outside. Like, this is an actually really difficult thing to learn, and you can actually hurt yourself doing it, and yet people are doing it anyway. In terms of like the more cultural part of it, there's actually a lot of research on cultures being either mycophilic, so like mushroom loving, or mycophobic, but also cultures can move between the two. So like Sweden is actually a really good example, where today Sweden is pretty much known for its like hobbyist mushroom hunting culture. Like people will go out and do it as a fall activity. They'll pay a tour guide to take them out. That wasn't the case 150 years ago. 150 years ago, people did not eat mushrooms in large amounts in Sweden. and it was actually a campaign by the government to increase food security that had a lot of pushback, but eventually caught on, and now it's a huge part of the Swedish national identity. So it's the sort of thing where Eastern Europe has been really into mushrooms for a really, really long time. But a lot of the places we think of today that are mushroom capitals, that's a pretty new thing.
That's really cool. Any other questions from folks? I know we've gone over, but this was just so great. I have to say, I just love hearing about this kind of like the research that you guys are doing. I just think this is so fun and exciting. Does anyone else want to ask any questions, or if not, I can call it. Great presentations, Dan and Amy. We are so thrilled to have you, and please do come to Sequanota, and you can give us updates, and we would love to hang out with you. And your presentations are awesome. Like, you both are just really terrific presenters and really terrific teachers, and I think we all learned so much. So just makes me very happy to know that future professors of mycology are here among us. Thanks guys.